Hey, so you know that you don't want to miss any episodes of 10 Minute Murder, and you want them the moment they're released. The best way to make that happen is to follow in whatever app you're listening right now. Depending on the app, it might say follow or subscribe or collect. Just hit that button and be the first to get new episodes.
10 Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10 Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10 Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. I'm Joe, the host. Hi, thank you for being here. A reminder, you can send me stories by emailing them to 10minutemurder@gmail.com. If there's a story you think I should take a look into about doing an episode on, 10minutemurder@gmail.com. That's probably the quickest and easiest way to get in touch with me. Or if you are connected with 10 Minute Murder on social media, you can do it there too. If we aren't connected on social media, dude, what the heck? Fix it. Come on now. Today's story, by the way, a couple things to note. First of all, it's going to be a little over 10 minutes. I don't ever count this part, like with me talking right now, into the actual meat of the story. So this part doesn't count. But the actual story of it, it's going to be more than 10 minutes. I don't know how much longer, not too much, but enough that I'm noting it now so that you're not like, what the heck's happening? And secondly, you're going to be kind of horrified and grossed out at certain parts of the story. So don't try to pretend later that you didn't get a warning. The moose out front should have told you. We've talked about domestic violence and broken relationships on this podcast before. We've talked about rape, and obviously we've talked about cannibalism, because that apparently is way more common with vicious murders than you would initially think. But today's story involves all of that. Now is not the time to grab a quick bite to eat if you have a weak stomach. This is the story of Katherine Knight. Katherine Knight was born and raised in a dysfunctional family, an exceptionally dysfunctional environment. Her mom, Barbara, had been married to Jack Ruhan and lived with him in Aberdeen, a small town in New South Wales, Hunter Valley. Barbara and Jack had 4 sons together. Then, Barbara began a relationship with a man named Ken Knight, a friend and co-worker of her husband's. She was still married to Jack, and it was scandalous in their small town when people found out, and of course they became the subject of gossip. The whisper campaign spread the word like a brush fire, and soon everybody knew their business. After getting tired of the sideways glances, and you know that feeling when you walk into a room and people all of a sudden stop talking, and you're like, okay, they were definitely talking about me. Well, Barbara and Ken were sick of that, and they left Barbara's 4 sons and moved to Maury. With Ken, Barbara had 4 more kids, including twin daughters. One of those daughters was Katherine, the future killer. When Jack died, 2 of Barbara's previous sons came to live with her and her new family with Ken. And you might think, wow, she left her husband and 4 kids to be with Ken. He must be a really great guy, very supportive. Nope. He was an alcoholic that openly used violence and intimidation to get his way. He would rape Barbara, sometimes up to 10 times a day. Barbara obviously resented Ken and in turn told her daughters intimate details of her sex life, about how much she hated men and sex with men. Katherine says she was assaulted by several members of her own family up until the age she was about 11. Apart from her sister, her twin sister, Katherine was only close with one other family member, her uncle Oscar. She was devastated when in 1969, Oscar committed suicide. She had a rough time trying to mentally deal with that and started saying that Oscar's ghost would visit her. That same year, the family moved back to the small town of Aberdeen. In high school, Katherine was a loner and a bully. She physically intimidated smaller students. There was at least one report of her attacking another male student with a weapon. And during a different incident, Katherine was injured by a teacher. When it was investigated, it turned out that the teacher was acting in self-defense. Katherine would act in polar opposites. When she wasn't being violent and aggressive, she was a model student with her behavior. Her classwork, though, wasn't going so well. Katherine couldn't read or write and ended up dropping out by the age 15 and got a job as a fabric cutter in a clothing factory. After a year of cutting clothes, she left that job for what she described as her dream job, cutting up entrails and organs at the local slaughterhouse. She was so efficient that she was promoted quickly and given her own very shiny new set of butcher knives. At home, she said she wanted the knives to be always handy when she needed them, so she hung them on the wall, over her bed. That's a practice she continued from that point on. It's often said that women will sometimes subconsciously find someone to marry that's a lot like their father. And that's exactly what Katherine did when she met hard-drinking co-worker David Kellett in 1973. While dating, David would occasionally hook up with Katherine's twin sister. David would pretty frequently get into fights, and Katherine was always there, quick to have his back. Like she'd throw hands with you. If you upset Katherine, she'd let you know about it and probably try to fight you too. In 1974, David and Katherine got married. At the wedding, Barbara, Katherine's mother, warned David that he needed to watch Katherine and be careful. She told him that she had a screw loose somewhere and would no doubt try to kill him if he stirred her up in the wrong way. Apparently, Barbara is some sort of Nostradamus because that night, that very night, the wedding night, Katherine tried to strangle David after he fell asleep. The reason? They only had sex 3 times before he fell asleep. Yikes. A marriage that starts off with violence like that is not a good sign, and theirs proved to be pretty vicious. In one incident, a very pregnant Katherine burned all of David's clothes while he was out at a darts competition. She thought he was gone too long and rewarded him with a frying pan to the head when he eventually did make it home. His skull was fractured and police were called, but charges were dropped after she told David she was sorry. After the baby was born, David bounced and moved to Queensland with another woman. Katherine, of course, didn't take that news so well and was admitted to the hospital and diagnosed with depression after she was seen violently shaking the newborn's baby stroller in public. When she was released, she took baby Melissa and left her on some train tracks, stole an axe, and went into town threatening people with it. Luckily, someone found the baby on the train tracks before a train came, and Katherine was put back into the hospital. And somehow, she was able to sign herself out the very next day. Just a few days later, she was trying to find a ride to Queensland to track down David. She asked a random lady for a ride, and when that lady refused, Katherine used a knife and slashed her face. So then the lady agreed. When they stopped for gas, the lady took that chance to escape and called police. By the time the police got there, Katherine had taken a little boy as a hostage. The police used brooms to disarm her and take her into custody. She was placed back into a hospital, but a different hospital this time, and David was notified of the incident. He broke up with the girlfriend and moved back to take care of Katherine. She was released in August of 1976 into the care of David and David's mother. They moved to Ipswich, where she got a job at a meatworks, which I assume is like a butcher or meatpacking place, similar to the work that she's done in the past with the knives that she loves so much. In March of 1983, she had their second child, a little girl named Natasha. The following year, Katherine left David and moved. She had injured her back and could no longer work, so she received government assistance in the form of housing and a disability pension. Katherine met a 38-year-old miner, David Saunders, in 1986. A few months later, he moved in with her and her daughters. She was jealous about what he might be up to when she was not around, so she would often throw him out. He'd always come back. In May of 87, she cut the throat of his 2-month-old dingo puppy in front of him, for no reason other than as being an example of what would happen to him if he ever had an affair, before going on to knock him unconscious with a frying pan. In June 1988, she gave birth to a third daughter, Sarah. Katherine decorated the house throughout with animal skins, skulls, horns, rusty animal traps, leather jackets, old boots, machetes, rakes, and pitchforks, kind of like a Cracker Barrel. No space, including the ceilings, was left uncovered. After an argument, she hit Saunders in the face with an iron before stabbing him in the stomach with a pair of scissors. He left, but eventually came back, and he found all of his clothes had been cut up. From there, he went into hiding. In 1997, Katherine got pregnant by 43-year-old slaughterhouse worker John Chillingworth. 3 years after their son Eric was born, she left him for a man named John Price, who she had been having an affair with for a while. John Price had 3 children of his own and was known around town as a pretty nice guy. His 2 older children lived with him full-time. John knew about Katherine's reputation and still agreed to move in with her in 1995. Apart from some violent arguments, he told people that life was a bunch of roses. A few years later, Katherine and John fought about him not wanting to get married to her. In retaliation, she videotaped a stash of medical kits that she thought he had stolen from work and sent that tape to his boss. It turns out the kits were out of date and were just trash, but his boss still fired him and John kicked her out. Eventually, they got back together, but John refused to let her move in with him. Starting in February of 2000, a series of attacks by Katherine led to him being stabbed in the chest by her. He lived and got a restraining order to keep her away from himself and the kids. The day of the restraining order, he told a coworker that if he didn't come into work tomorrow, it would be because Katherine had murdered him. When he got home that day, he found that his children were not home. She had sent them for a sleepover. Earlier that day, she videotaped a crude will and bought herself some black lingerie. John spent much of the evening hiding out at a neighbor's house, and when he felt it was safe to go home, he did, and he fell asleep. He awoke to a freshly showered Katherine, and they had sex. After that, he fell back asleep. By 6 a.m., when John didn't show up for work, his boss sent an employee to his house to check on him. No one answered the door, so they called the police. And the police got there and saw blood on the door, so they broke it open and found John's body inside, along with an unconscious Katherine. She had taken a bunch of pills. Apparently, while John was sleeping, she stabbed him with a butcher's knife. He woke up and tried to escape, but bled out before he could, as he had been stabbed at least 37 times. Katherine drove to an ATM and withdrew $1,000 of his money. After he was dead, Katherine skinned John and hung up his skin stretched throughout a couple of rooms in the house. She cut his head off and cooked parts of his body with baked potatoes, pumpkin, zucchini, cabbage, yellow squash, and gravy. She had 2 place settings at the dinner table for each of John's children, with their names written on place cards. She was preparing to serve their father to them in a meal. A third portion of the meal had been thrown into the backyard, where Katherine had apparently attempted to eat him herself. John's head was still on the stove in a pot, stewing with vegetables. In court, Katherine Knight offered to plead guilty to manslaughter. That was obviously rejected. She pled not guilty to murder. On November 8, 2001, Justice O'Keefe pointed out that the nature of the crime and her lack of remorse required a severe penalty. He sentenced her to life imprisonment, refused to fix a non-parole period, and ordered that her papers be marked never to be released, the first time that this had been imposed on a woman in Australian history. Today in prison, other inmates call her Nana. That's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. Thanks for listening today. And if you have a story you'd like for me to cover in a podcast episode, email it to 10minutemurder@gmail.com. If this is the first time that you're listening to this podcast and you enjoyed it, I hope you'll consider subscribing and connect with me on social media, and be sure to tell your friends that are into true crime stories like this about the podcast. Lastly, if you're an Apple Podcasts user, be sure to review and rate 5 stars. Doing that helps the show grow and reach more people, and plus, it's always nice to read your kind words. Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Murder. Have a good night.